Welcome back to our series Drawing with Inkscape. In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to use the various shape tools. In Inkscape, we have four shape tools. We have the rectangle, we have the ellipses, we have the star, and we have the spiral. Let's start with the rectangle tool. If I click on the rectangle tool and I draw a shape on my canvas, you'll see I get a standard rectangle here, and you'll also notice that there are two different kinds of marks here. There's a square mark and a round mark. Notice the square mark is in the upper left corner and also in the lower right corner of the object. There are actually three different kinds of marks that we'll see in various tools depending on the tool. We have the square, the round, and a diamond. For now, for the rectangular, we'll only be looking at the square and at the round. The square is used to resize the object. So I can drag the object in different directions and it changes the size of that object. And the same is true if I do it from the lower right. The round, however, is used to change the shape of the object, the rectangle, to curve the corners of the rectangle into a rounder shape. So those are the purposes of those two marks. Now, if you're not sure or can't remember what the marks are used for, if you look down here in this status area at the bottom of the screen, when I hover over the mark, you'll see that there's a description of what it does. Adjust the width and height of the rectangular, or with control to lock the ratio and stretch in one dimension only. And with the round, you'll notice it says adjust the horizontal rounding, radius, and with control make the vertical radius the same. So let's look at what happens when I use the control key. You'll notice how I can only change in one direction. I can't have a non-proportional shape here going on when I keep the control button. And the same thing here with the radius. You notice it doesn't it these two circles are moving proportionally. I cannot change the vertical without changing the horizontal radius. Another thing to point out is that you'll notice that as we go through all of the tools, underneath the control bar here, there's a tools bar that has information in it that's relevant to the tool that we're using. So in this case, for the rectangular tool, we have a box that has the width, the height, and the rounding of the X and Y coordinates. And then we also have here a reset button. Basically, it's going to take the object back to its original shape. I want to undo that because I want to keep the rounded circle. All right, so now one of the interesting things about this is the change bar here, or the tools bar, remembers what is your last drawing. So if I change the color, for example, of this drawing, and you see its rounded shape, so if I then go in and delete this object, and then I create a new object, notice that it remembered the shape of the old object and the color, and therefore reproduce that. I didn't need to do it again. Now if I draw another object, you'll see again it's remembering what the shape is that I previously used. And one final point to note here is if you want to move from one object to another, you can just click on the object, and that's how you select it when you're in the tool, the rectangle tool. Now let's clean this up a bit, and let's get out of that. let's move this object. I have to go back to selector tool. Alright, now let's go back to the rectangle tool, and I want to make this a rectangle again. So I click on the reset button and it goes back to a rectangle. Now let's say that I want to create a perfect square. One of the ways that I can do that is to hold down the the control key and start drawing, and you'll notice that it is creating a proportional object where the height and the width are exactly the same. And if you look up here, you'll see the height and the width are exactly the same. So that's how we know this is a square. But you noticed when I was dragging, it was doing something else as well. So let's get rid of this object. And let's get rid of this one. And let's reuse the tool again with the control. This time I'm going to drag horizontally. Notice it creates a square, but then if I start moving horizontally, it starts creating a rectangle. But you notice that jump when I move too far. What happens is, there we go. You see, it's creating a rectangular that's proportionally. Um, so here we have a 2 by 1. You'll notice that the height is 53 and the width is 106. So the width is exactly twice the height. If you want to create a rectangle that has those proportional ratios, then you can use the control key to do that as well. And then finally, if you want to do something with the shape, again, let's delete this. And I want to draw a shape holding down the shift key. You'll see what happened is that the drawing starts where I have my mouse, and then it creates the shape with the starting point as the center of the object. That's with the shift key. Alright, let's get rid of the second object and let's go back to our original object. You noticed that when we were experimenting with this before, there were two circles. So when we start out, there's only one circle. And if I click on that, you'll notice that the shape is happening in one dimension and the object is not changing. What's changing is just the roundness of the corners, and now of course I have two circles. So really what it is in the corner you have two circles, one that overlays the other, and when you start to move it, that's when it happens. Now this other circle is used to move your object in the other direction. So if you want to have not as rounded not as rounded shape, you would work this until you hit the center of the object, and here of course works in this dimension. One of the curious things about rectangles is that, especially rounded ones, is that when I resize the rectangle, the corners, I keep doing that, don't I? The corners don't scale proportionally unless, if you go to the selector tool, you have this option here. It says when scaling rectangles, scale the radii of rounded corners. So I had this turned off so the rounded corners weren't being scaled. And if I turn that on and then go back to my rectangle and I resize, now sorry, I've got my other object interfering again. Now you'll see that the rounded, the radii of the rounds are also scaling proportionally. All right, let's now look at the ellipse tool. If I draw an ellipse tool and I want to make a perfect circle, just like we did with the square, we would do Control and then draw the tool, and the proportions will be such that we'll have a circle. If I want to create an ellipse, just like I was able to create a rectangle that kept proportional width and height, I can do the same thing with a circle, make it into an ellipsis by holding down the control key. And as I start to build a circle, you see if I drag to another dimension to the right, I create a perfect ellipse that is 2 to 1 proportionally, or if I keep going, it'll be 3 to 1. And just like with the rectangle, if I hold down the shift key, then the object that I build will be centered on the point, my starting point. Now you'll notice that in my object here, when I delete, okay, let's make this, if you'll notice here, this is the resizing tool. It allows me to move in one direction, and the other resizing tool allows me to move in the other direction. You'll notice that we also only seem to have one circle here, but this circle mark is actually two, and so if I click on it, I can use it to create a pie chart or a segment. As you notice here, when I move this, it's changing the shape there. So I can move around and add something like that. Um, I can make it larger. I can change the shape like that. It's too close. You can see I can flatten. So these rounding tools are used to change the shape of the ellipsis. The next shape I want to show you is the star shape. This is probably the most interesting one to work with in Inkscape because it has a lot of potential. Now if we start, we just basically draw a star of default is going to be 5 points. So we could do that, and as you can see I can rotate it. As I pull, the points all grow proportionally. I can change the shape up here in the tools control bar. You see we have a choice between a rectangle, a hexagon or a polygon, sorry, or star. And then I can change the number of the points by how many corners here. So if, for example, I'm working with a hexagon, or here's a pentagon, I want to change it to, let's reduce this a little so we can see what we're doing. Alright, I want to change this to be a hexagon, or I can do many more shapes. So let's say we want to do 8, and 8, then you have your familiar octagon. If say I was working on a stop sign or something like that, I could do that from this. And star, same thing. I can change the shape to a star, and now it has 8. What's interesting is this goes all the way up to 1024. You shouldn't go so high if you don't have a fast computer, but look what happens if I just type in 200. Doesn't look like a star anymore, but it is. So experimenting with this, you can come up with a lot of different kinds of graphics. like that effect, for example. There's so much we can do with this that you have to just experiment and see what it is that you want to do. But I will give you a few more pointers. Okay, let's revert back to our original star with 5 points, or 5 corners. And one of the things that you'll see here is, again, we have 2 objects, so let me get rid of the back one. I'm sorry, I keep doing this. Alright, let's convert this to 5 corners. Alright, so we have our original shape. Now, one of the things that you can do, as I pointed out already, with this drag handle, you can pull and lengthen the points or the corners, and notice that everything happens proportionally, no skewing. With this one, however, we can skew. So not only can I make the star's body fatter or thinner, but then I also can rotate, so I can create different interesting shapes this way as well. And then what happens if we increase this to, let's say, 100? Again, you see we have interesting shapes that are possible. One final thing I'd like to point out about stars is, you're probably wondering, how can I round a star like I was able to round a rectangle? Because obviously the marks here didn't do any rounding. They were changing the shape of the object itself and not necessarily doing any rounding. So the way to do that is, if you hold down the shift key and pull on one of these handles, you'll see what happens here. Things start to round. And if I shift here, you'll see that by clicking on the object, it returns to its original shape. The final tool I want to look at in this lecture is the spiral. So if I click on the spiral tool and I just drag, you notice that the spiral is created with the center being the start point. Now, you see there are 2 handles here, one on the inner side and one on the outer side. If I just click on that, you notice all that's happening here is I'm just adding more lines to the spiral. And the same thing here in the middle. If I click on that, I can unravel the spiral as well. So that's without any of the, just with clicking on those 2 endpoints. Alright, now what do I want to do if I want to resize? Well, if I hold down the shift key and click on the outer handle, you'll notice that I can resize the shape, the spiral. Now if I click on the Alt key and I hold or click on the outer handle, you notice that I can add more lines to the shape, but I'm not changing the radius. Then if I want to work with the inner circle, if I hold down the Alt key and click on the inner handle, you see I can change by going down. I can change that, or by going up I can change it in this direction as well. So we have ways to experiment with the spiral this way. And if I hold down the Alt key and click on the diamond, it immediately goes back to the original shape. Now, once again, there's so much more we could do with the spiral tool, but the best would be for you to experiment with it, especially if you're more artistic than I am. I'm sure you'll find all kinds of interesting uses for all of these tools. The other thing that I'd like to point out to you is that Inkscape is at times a little bit buggy, so make sure you save your work often. While I was producing this video, Inkscape crashed twice. So if I had been working on a real project, I would have lost all of my information if I hadn't been saving. So please make sure that when you are working on something that you do frequent saves so that you don't lose your information.